Testing 3, 2, 1. Hello, hello. Mugi, can you hear us? Okay, so he says louder. So you'll just hold it up close to your mouth. But we're okay. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. I've known Steve for any number of years. The first number is very close to beginning with a 7, as he and I met in Madison at Grace Church as elementary school students. Steve's program is one that he has developed over the years. He used it extensively while teaching. He's been very active making presentations like this in the community, and they're really very interesting. As you know, political cartoons are substantive. They are biting, and they can be pointed, and they are edgy at times, and they can be powerful, and they can be memorable. They can be occasionally offensive, probably. We'll see today. Sometimes they are stimulating, but they are always thought-provoking. It's my thought that the most efficient kind of political and social commentary is political cartoons. So Steve is going to be our guide today, and he will take us through the state of the world, a small subject, and the State of the Union, another small subject, and he will do it through political cartoons.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that introduction. And welcome to all of you who are here in the Great Hall, and welcome to those of you who've joined us online. It's my pleasure this morning to present this show, which I've entitled The State of the World and the State of the Union in Political Cartoons, subtitled, What Are You Going to Do About It? And it's important for me to issue this disclaimer at the outset. The opinions expressed in the cartoons which follow do not necessarily represent those of this presenter, nor those of the Episcopal Bishop of Milwaukee, or the rector and the vestry of Christ Church, Whitefish Bay. And an advisory. Tom gave you a hint here. Political cartoons are not just funny drawings. The best, indeed, are provocative and may be offensive to those who disagree with the point of view in the cartoon. So, fair warning, there may be times in the show when you are offended. The subtitle of this show, this presentation, is What Are You Going to Do About It? Christianity teaches us that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers. This, in my view, obligates us as individual Christians and as a church to respond to the problems facing the world and the United States. The phrase, "What are you going to do about it?" comes from the famous 19th century political cartoonist Thomas Nast, who sometimes called the father of American political cartooning. And he is, in fact, the creator of the modern popular image of Santa Claus. And here is Nast at the bottom, flanked by his hero, Santa Claus, and by his nemesis, Boss Tweed of the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. In this cartoon, the famous cartoon, Boss Tweed, Nast's nemesis, is the emperor in the background watching the spectacle in front of him. The Tammany tiger, representing Tweed's political machine, has mauled the fair maiden Columbia, the symbol of the United States at the time. The allusion, of course, is to the slaughter of Christians in the Colosseum in ancient Rome. And the message is a call to action. The show is divided into 4 parts. Part 1 is We Live in Extraordinary Times. Part 2, Troubles and Challenges Abroad. Part 3, Troubles and Challenges at Home. And Part 4, what are we going to do about these challenges facing us? The show features about 125, 130 political cartoons by some 50 political cartoonists. Most of these are American. Bolded are those whose cartoons appear quite frequently. There are 3 who have Wisconsin roots in the second column. Phil Hands is currently the political cartoonist of the Wisconsin State Journal in Madison. Joe Heller, formerly the political cartoonist of the Green Bay Press Gazette. And finally, down the column, Gary Markstein, who was one of the last cartoonists of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Part 1, we live in extraordinary times. The news is that we face twin viruses, COVID-19 and Vladimir Putin. The new variants of COVID-19 are singing in the rain of falling mask mandates, perhaps a cause for concern. Vladimir Putin of Russia, claiming there is no Ukraine, only my crane, in an effort to make Russia great again, has launched this invasion to make Ukraine Russian again. He has defended his action as legitimate political discourse. Where have we heard that before? Our country is hopelessly divided. This is the result of our wild and crazy previous president, this president made a mess of things while he was in office, in the opinion of this cartoonist, Joel Pett. And the divisiveness now is reflected in a tug of war, with one side pleading, "Don't tread on me," and the other, "Don't spread on me." With gun violence rampant in America in these extraordinary times, stores must take extra precautions. Then there is the race problem, the race that we still struggle with. Are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? This cartoonist implies no. Neither is the world. Note that the falling dominoes are gravestones. Let's turn to part 2. We're going to focus particularly on 3 challenges: the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and environmental catastrophe. Now, there's no question that COVID definitely caught us by surprise a couple of years ago, and now it has a very tight grip on the world. We discovered an effective vaccine in record time, but then we were overwhelmed by a second wave of the virus. Our efforts to vaccinate against these new variants has been a challenge. And as they say, the band played on. Making things worse on the world scene, this past January, Russian President Vladimir Putin, riding bareback and shirtless, as he's wont to do, on top of the Russian bear, invaded Ukraine, upsetting the world order. Before the Russian invasion, many Americans did not see Putin as a serious threat. Indeed, our previous president had a pretty good relationship with Putin, a bromance, if you will. Trump's opponents, however, were wary. They thought Putin was playing Trump like a world-class cellist. To these critics, Putin helped Trump win the 2016 election. He was Vlad in the box, the nut hacker. During his term, these critics believed, Putin was the recipient of top secret intelligence from the U.S. Pez. When Putin dispatched troops into Ukraine, many thought he had gone absolutely mad. Critics began comparing him to his protege, dictator Bashar al-Assad of Syria, the Frankenstein monster created by Putin, the vampire, the violator of human rights. President Biden, taking office, having made a mess of things in Afghanistan, decided that Putin had to be confronted before things got out of hand in Ukraine. Biden's solution? Sanctions on Russia. Unfortunately, the sanctions have had little effect on Putin. He has become the butcher of Bucha, a savage conqueror, a perpetrator of war crimes, and a nuclear threat. Meanwhile, another tragedy has been unfolding in many places around the world, not front and center like the Russian invasion. Still, it has caught the attention of more and more people and world leaders and the press. Climate change. The melting of the polar ice caps and more frequent weather catastrophes, wildfires, violent tornadoes, tidal waves, desertification. Some have refused to acknowledge this trend. Not this cartoonist who tells the climate change denier, liar, liar, planet's on fire. And not God declaring, how can we be so dense and not see the signs? So those are world problems, world challenges. Part 3, let's look at some of the challenges we face here at home. Specifically, we're going to look at our broken political system, racism, the proliferation of guns and gun violence, immigration, and sexual harassment. 50 years ago, at the time of the tumult of the 1960s, Mad magazine proclaimed that our country was out of order. Many would say the same thing about the USA today. Why? Well, for starters, Congress has become a Mickey Mouse operation. The presidency is out of order, not just with Trump, but with perhaps Biden as well. The Supreme Court has been politicized. It is no longer the impartial tribunal that the Founding Fathers envisioned, as quite a few Trump clones sit on its bench. Much to the chagrin of the Big Four presidents on Mount Rushmore, the previous president has showed no respect for the Congress. When he arrived in Washington, D.C., Trump was a veritable wrecking ball. He was Trumpzilla, a threat to civilization as we know it. He was the Lion King. Marie Antoinette in terms of the COVID pandemic. In the area of foreign relations, Donald the Menace. In the area of civil rights, Robert E. Trump. This controversial president, to the relief of many, Mr. Trump, was not reelected. However, Trump refused to accept the results. He alleged voting irregularities in key states, among them Wisconsin. Biden's majorities in those states, Trump claimed, were a fake hook. And Trump mobilized his congressional allies to raise doubts about the results. Out went Graham and Jordan and Getz. Fly, my flunkies. Obstruct, delay, protect. When that failed, Trump rallied his followers to storm the Capitol to overturn the election. Most Republicans ate up the big lie about the election. Not, of course, Lynn Cheney. Regarding the January 6th insurrection, which followed, most Republicans heard no evil, saw no evil, spoke no evil. Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson proclaimed, "Didn't seem like an armed insurrection to me." Now, all evidence since January 6th points to Trump trying to ride the big lie with a little help from voter suppression all the way to the 2024 election. Meanwhile, there were big hopes that the newly elected president, Joe Biden, would turn things around in Washington. Polls, however, have registered public disappointment in Biden. Cartoonists seem to agree. Cartoonist Gary Varvel has depicted Biden as Mr. Magoo and the incredible shrinking president. Cartoonist Bob Gorell has caricatured him with rose-colored glasses. Cartoonist A.F. Bronco has been even more harsh, drawing Biden, accompanied by a laughing Vice President Kamala Harris, as fiddling while Rome and Washington burned. The consensus seems to be that our government is broken. Furthermore, America is still wrestling with racism, particularly among police officers. Now, we know America has a long experience with racism. Here is a brief history of the black man's neck. This past year, a jury in a Minnesota courtroom declared, in this case of police brutality, that black lives do matter. However, in spite of this ruling, some cartoonists have drawn cartoons that suggest blacks will continue to face mistreatment by the police. Here is one of those cartoons. Here is another. Most of you probably remember Barney Fife of Mayberry. Here is a third cartoon. To deal with this problem, some say current police officer exams are lame, and these exams must be made more rigorous. Some liberals have called for defunding the police. However, moderates and conservatives believe that defunding is a bad idea. It's just not a realistic solution because of the proliferation of guns in our society. We are one nation under guns. Guns are us. Guns are easily available for all kinds of occasions, at schools, at the workplace, at the movie theater, easily available. Furthermore, the Republican-supported NRA will not allow most gun restrictions. Their point of view is, let bygones be bygones. Immigration is another challenge facing America. The U.S. is becoming the old woman in the shoe who has so many children, especially on the U.S.-Mexican border, that she does not know what to do. Our previous president advocated a tough policy on immigration, including sharks and crocodiles in the waters around the United States. The showpiece of Trump's policy was a huge wall, a wall that was going to be paid for by the Mexican government. Trump envisioned a wall like the Berlin Wall. Here he is discussing that with Chancellor Angela Merkel. Now, Trump's followers were even more insistent on the need for a wall. Maybe add a lid, too. As for the immigrant who'd already gotten in, Trump followers, echoing a phrase from the 2016 campaign, they wanted to lock her up. Now, the current president's immigration policy, President Biden's immigration policy, has not been as strong. Don't come. And a scarecrow on the border. That may not be enough. Now, there is another problem, the problem of sex crimes, sexual predators, and sexual harassment in the workplace. Men appear to be clueless. Is it hands off and pants on, or hands on and pants off? In the last 2 years, there have been several, or 3 or 4 years actually, there have been several high-profile cases of this terrible problem, beginning with Bill Cosby of the Bill Cosby Show fame. On the left, in the show, he was Dr. Huxtable. Outside the show, on the right, he was Mr. Hyde. Then, film producer Harvey Weinstein. You ought to be in pictures. You ought to be in mugshots. Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh came under criticism. Here he is depicted as Blutarsky in the film Animal House. Prince Andrew of the British royal family got in the act. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Jerry Jeffrey Epstein and his two buddies. Sadly, church leaders have been guilty of sexual harassment as well. In response to this harassment, women have organized the Me Too movement to challenge the chauvinist pigs. More needs to be done here. Now, all of these challenges, foreign and domestic, are troubling. So, we return to the Nass cartoon and Nass' question. What are we going to do about it? Let's first consider the citizen response and what might be the Christian response. So we turn to part 4. First, the citizen response. As cartoonist Nick Anderson implies in this cartoon, whining and griping are lame and unproductive. Doing nothing as well is not an option. The vote ought to be the fundamental response. Here, cartoonist David Fitzsimmons says that voting advances the cause or the creation of a more perfect union. Fortunately, most people delight in having the right to vote. They can't wait to throw the scoundrels out. Voting itself, of course, is not always the answer. Sometimes we don't have good choices. And further, it is becoming more difficult to vote as voters have to navigate the maze of regulations regarding the right to vote. Now, the First Amendment to the Constitution, which we often celebrate, offers us guidance on other actions citizens can take to address the challenges facing us, beginning with free speech, a form of protest that is in keeping with our tradition of protesting nonviolently. No bricks, please. And a free press. We can send letters to the editors of our newspapers. Indeed, newspapers and other media are key pillars of our democracy. But watch out for fake news and hate speech found all over the internet, notably on Facebook. Then, besides free press, free speech, there is the freedom of assembly as a way citizens can take action. Consider taking a knee in a public place for a good cause. Of course, not all kinds of assembly are in keeping with our tradition of protesting nonviolently. Many, including cartoonist Jeff Koterba, believe the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol is evidence that our democracy is in trouble. Most would agree that neither of these actions on Capitol Hill represent legitimate political discourse. We certainly don't want a future where this is our pledge of allegiance. One nation, under mob, reprehensible, with enmity and malice for all. And we don't want future presidential candidates behaving like children, name-calling in sandboxes. And we don't want our presidential candidates acting like guests on the Jerry Springer show. Very, very scary. Bottom line, Citizens can do something, but there are limits, and some have already crossed the line. What about Christians? What's the Christian response? What can we do, we who call ourselves Christians, do about the challenges facing us? My answer would be prayer. Not just prayer, but what I would call prayer plus action. I'm not talking about what many consider is the standard view of prayer, a list of requests made to God. Rather, I'm talking about engaging with God, seeking to discern what He wants. Having an encounter with God, a conversation with God, talking with God as prayer. We can remember this kind of prayer by the acronym PEACE, P-E-A-C-E. This is prayer where we pause, pause, in the midst of our hectic life. Where we, express solidarity with God and humankind, all our brothers and sisters. Acknowledge that there is more to do, more challenges to face, wrestle with. C, confess that we individually and as congregations can do more and discern a plan of action. And finally, E, execute that plan of action. Peace. Prayer plus. We can pray as individual Christians, and act as individual Christians. We can pray as congregations and execute our plan of action as congregations. Prayer plus action. The basic question, in my view, in this kind of prayer is WWJD. What would Jesus do? Now, this requires that we have a good sense of who Jesus is and what His message is. In this 1917 cartoon, Art Young, one of the most famous cartoonists in U.S. history, draws this wanted poster, which characterizes Jesus as an agitator, a troublemaker, not an establishment kind of guy. More recently, cartoonist Mike Peters reminds us that Jesus was, back then, and it still is, not a popular figure. Cartoonist Steve Breen, in this cartoon, is emphasizing Jesus' commitment to peacemaking. The thorns in Jesus' crown are gun-toting soldiers. Cartoonist David Horsey reminds us that the primary concern of the so-called weirdo in the white robe is his primary concern is helping the least of his brothers and sisters. Remember, whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, that you do unto me. In this cartoon, we have Jesus walking into a bar, lamenting what his followers over the ages have done in his name. In this cartoon, Jesus' Father, God the Father, has a similar lament about what his followers have done in his name. Now, the saints of the church and modern church leaders offer wisdom and guidance about what we can do. Consider what St. Francis of Assisi has said. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. Consider the words of the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of America, Michael Curry. Being a Christian is not essentially about going to church or being a nice person, but about following in the footsteps of Jesus, taking his teachings seriously, and in so doing, helping to change the world. And hear the message of Pope Francis, depicted here as Moses, with his tablet on climate change. And by all means, beware of false prophets and gods. Here's perhaps one of them, speculating, maybe I'm the chosen one. I mean, has anyone seen Jesus' birth certificate? Here we have Charlton Heston as Moses with key phrases from the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image and bow down to it. Bear in mind what Jesus said at the Last Supper. One of you will betray me. And it came to pass that the Christian right followed a false god. And Republicans built and worshiped the golden calf. My view, as good Christians, we must return to basic principles. Paul's letter to the Galatians. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. In 21st century terms, what that means is that all lives matter. And we must reject antimatter. Hate, injustice, fear. Now, while the knee has been lifted, we need to recognize that there is more to do to achieve Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. Blacks and whites need to work together, beginning with conversations. Good starting place. Otherwise, we will remain divided. Both white batteries and black batteries are required to make America run. Regarding COVID, we have already responded to the call to arms. But we must guard against complacency, as COVID-19 virus will continue to mutate. We must stand with Ukraine, or the virus, Putin, will mutate. Other dictators will be emboldened, and they will roll back democracy. And we would likely face the prospect of endless war. If we do nothing to stop the efforts to restrict the vote, there will be another meaning of voting rights. If we do nothing about gun violence, here's what our schoolyards will look like. If we do nothing about climate change, here is what is likely to happen. So I would say it's up to us. Bear in mind the words of St. Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. No hands, no feet, but yours. Yours are the feet with which he is to go about doing good. So what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about these challenges and troubles? You're going to start walking. You're going to take steps. You're going to use your feet. Remembering yours are the feet with which he is to go about doing good. Thank you. And there is time for questions. I'd be happy to entertain questions. I assume those of you who support Trump and those of you who support Biden found a few irritating, offensive cartoons. But I warned you. Tom, do you want to pass around the microphone, or Nancy? Who has a question or a comment?
Yeah, have you tried getting something like this on the local PBS station? Something that looks, I don't remember seeing any political cartoon show on PBS or anything, but this is a great presentation. Have you approached anyone about doing this?
Well, I've done this presentation for different groups, church groups, men groups. Not one as religious as I would call this one, but I've done them in private homes for gatherings. I haven't done anything on TV or for a huge audience, and I'm not sure how comfortable I would be in doing it. The sad thing about political cartoons is you don't see them very often anymore. You used to see them sometimes in the front page, but at least on the editorial page of newspapers. About 15 years ago, there were 250 political cartoonists working for newspapers or freelancing in this country. Now there are fewer than 50. And I think because of the fact they're just stills, they don't have the dynamism and therefore the attraction to a lot of people. I'm sad. I read the New York Times discontinued cartoons. The Journal Sentinel, ironically, had 2 cartoonists and then sacked them both about 15 years ago. Wisconsin State Journal is the only newspaper I know that carries at least in this area, that carries a regular full-time cartoonist. That's Phil Hands, and he puts a cartoon in the newspaper 5 days a week.
Thank you for doing this. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
I was just amazed. Where do you get the cartoons?
Well, online. In the 80s and 90s, when I was doing this, I was clipping newspapers every weekend and Xeroxing them. But in the last 10 years, everything is online. There are certain cartoon websites, and some cartoonists have their own individual websites. So for this presentation, I looked at least 1,000 different cartoons, narrowed it down to maybe 300, 350, and then picked about 130, 140. It takes time, but you can find them and download them and then put them in a Keynote or a PowerPoint.
Steve, this was excellent. The slides you selected were superb, how you sequenced them, and how you built to a positive message that calls us to go within. Ultimately, we have to do that. There isn't some quick fix answer outside. I encourage you to find new audiences, and if you want, I'll convene a think tank, and we'll plan different kinds of strategies for you to do this. It's important.
Well, thank you. One of the things I should point out to you is that I do not get the rights to these cartoons and to show these cartoons. I have been to now 4, maybe 5 annual conventions of the American Cartoonists, the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists, AAEC. And I've talked to the cartoonists there, and I've said, I want to use these cartoons in my classroom. I want to use them for various events around the community. Do I have to get permission? Do I have to get these licensed? And to a cartoonist, they said, you don't have to, as long as you cite somewhere in the presentation the cartoonist you're using, so I do that, and as long as you don't make a profit from your venture. So I have to be careful. I'm not sure I want to go on TMJ or even PBS, and because somebody may come after me, even though I've been told, don't worry about it. We appreciate that you're publicizing our cartoons and trying to keep the art of political cartooning alive. So, but thank you for your offer. I'll do some at a private gathering or for another church group or other interest group.
Yeah,
Greg.
Steve, I really echo what Bob said, and what you have really created with everything you've been collecting for all these years is quite a history of political cartoons in this country. And I agree with Bob how you weave that. This is the second time I've seen you do this kind of presentation, and it's different, when you do them. So you're updating them and adapting them and so forth. One thing I just wanted to say, and I wonder what your thought of is on it, is that while we're seeing the diminishment of newspapers and of fewer political cartoonists, we do see the rise of political satirists. So, for example, Jon Stewart, who I understand is going to be aired on PBS for just receiving the Mark Twain honor for comedy, but he's kind of the father of modern political, and maybe there are others before him, but he just seemed, with the Daily Show, he really concentrated on political cartoon, in a live setting. I just wondered what your thought is about the next generation memes on, we see a lot of memes, for example, on social media, and these other political satirists.
Yeah. Well, I think as newspapers go, so will political cartoons go. Newspapers will die out, and I think there will be fewer and fewer political cartoons. Now, you'll notice I have a bias in what political cartoons I use. I don't use strips, and I don't put in cartoons that require a lot of work for people to study and analyze. I want cartoons that have a bold message, and it's hard-hitting, and you get it right away. But back in the day, NAS became very popular because people couldn't read, but they could see pictures. And it's interesting, a true story, Boss Tweed fled the United States, went to Spain, and was captured in Spain and extradited back to the United States. Caught in Spain, because someone had seen a NAS cartoon, and that's how he got caught. But you know, I think this kind of satire you're talking about will always exist for, you know, the sophisticated public consumer. But I don't know about cartoons. I'm skeptical.
More interested in your reaction to this. I agree with you, and it seems pretty clear. You know, print newspapers. I mean, the Journal Sentinel now is mostly ads for hearing aids, lift chairs, and things for, you know, guys my age and older. And if they go, there go what remains of the cartoonists. But I wonder also, at least to me, it seems like people have lost the ability to find anything like tolerance or a sense of humor about someone else's opinion. And your cartoons in particular, they were not soft-spoken, you know, and political cartoons are a punch in the face quite frequently. And I don't think people have gotten over the idea that I have to be right, and therefore I can't tolerate it. I wonder if that's played into the demise of cartoonists. And even satire, like Greg mentioned, you know, there's a difference between satire and mocking meanness and so forth.
That's my intuition as well, Dave. I do think we don't laugh about ourselves enough. We don't want to see cartoons that challenge our point of view, and cartoonists do that all the time.
Steve, I just totally loved this presentation. It was absolutely magnificent. Thank you so much. My question is, can you tell us a little bit about your background in working with cartoons? What initially led you into seeing and beginning to assemble collections of cartoons as a vehicle for truth?
Well, that's a great question. I had been teaching about 7 or 8 years, and I just happened to read in some teacher journal about another teacher who'd used a cartoon in a lesson. Saw that, and I thought, I'm going to try that. And that got the ball rolling. And over the years, not only would I use cartoons in lesson plans, but I'd also put them on quizzes and tests, because what they did is they required kids to do critical thinking. The kids not only had to know the subject, so who were the characters in the political cartoon, what was the context, what was the situation or the event, and they had to think it through. In the first couple of years, I made those cartoons extra credit points on quizzes and tests, but then kids got used to it, and I felt I could get away with it, and so I had them I did put them on tests. The challenge has always been to make, especially in the classroom, to make sure I'm balanced. You probably see me try to do that. You know, I had some anti-Biden cartoons, which are harder to find. Cartoons criticizing President Trump are much more prevalent. And that's because 80% of the political cartoonists cartooning today are liberal, 20% are conservative. Now it used to be 90-10, but the conservative cartoonists have banded together and they've recruited some fellow conservative cartoonists. But just like, you know, because of Fox News, the conservatives kind of own the cable airwaves, and the liberals are outgunned there. Just the reverse among political cartoonists. So when I taught and used the cartoons in my classroom, I had to make sure, for example, if I had if we were studying the 1960 election, I'd make sure that there were anti-Nixon as well as anti-Kennedy cartoons.
Thank you so much. As a member of the Forum Committee, A+.
Well, thank you.
So
Thank you.
thank you. My question is regarding your style of teaching, which really worked for me personally, because an example is just all of the different ways Putin was depicted. I didn't recognize him in a whole bunch of them, but your explanation that was quick, I got just, really quickly. But without your explanation, I'm not sure I would have passed your test with it as extra credit.
Well, I'm always talking.
But I just wanted to say how, the flow of your teaching was really fabulous. So how did you come about this style?
It's taken a lot of practice. When I first started doing these shows, there was too much text in the balloons, and I felt I had to do too much explaining of the cartoons, and so it was easy to get bogged down. Now I've figured out about how much time I need for each visual image and how much I need to say. But it's a work in progress, and I'm always trying to do better. I rehearse, several times, and the show is a lot different today from what it was a week ago today. And you want to string the cartoons along so that you can develop a narrative. That narrative is very important. Meredith.
Stephen, the way that parents are more involved in what's going on in the classroom, particularly the nitty-gritty in the classroom today than they were, say, 20 years ago, do you think that if you were teaching today, you'd have to be ultra careful of what you used?
Yes.
And do you think parents would object? Some parents would object to
I
some?
think there'd be some concern. You're not just the facts man, not opinions. We just want our kids to be exposed to the facts, no opinions. Not even if you're saying, well, I try to present opinions on both sides. I remember just before I retired, which was about 10 years ago, I had been using cartoons from the 1880s and 1890s, which had racial and ethnic caricatures, stereotypes. And I had some parents come in, and I decided not to do battle with them, and so I stopped doing that, even though I felt that was so important to explain to the students that this was the way things were 100 years ago. But they didn't want to see these racial stereotypes. They were worried that, or these ethnic stereotypes, the kids would not appreciate they were historical and very inappropriate today.
Are there cartoons in this show that we saw that you think you wouldn't be able to use in the classroom today? I mean, we, of course, can't remember all the cartoons, but...
Well, I would hesitate to use the cartoons on sexual harassment, sexual predators. I'm not sure if I were teaching a Catholic school, I would show the cartoon which has a bishop of the church being a sexual predator. Let me give you an example of how this was different from the presentation I did about 3 months ago at the Town Club. I know my audience at the Town Club is a lot different from my audience here. So I didn't have the religious piece, which is the last quarter of the presentation. I wanted to tailor and use that because of this venue. But I knew my audience was pretty conservative. I would imagine 3/4 conservative, 1/4 liberal. And so I had to work really hard, and I counted how many anti-Trump cartoons were and how many anti-Biden cartoons there were. Here I had probably a 25 to 11 or 12 ratio, 25 anti-Trump, 11 or 12 anti-Biden. It's important to me to show both sides, but the town club, I think it was 39 and 38, because I was afraid that some of the people in the audience would be counting. And, but it's very hard with only a minority of cartoonists being anti-liberal to find those cartoons. Always thinking about my audience. I never got any criticism except on occasion about a particular cartoon. But remember, that I taught in from the 70s to 2012. A lot has happened since 2012. I don't know if I could get away with it. I'd be really hard pressed. The other thing is that I was able to do it, for example, I did annual shows in the auditorium at University School, and kids had been in my classes, so they knew political cartoons, they knew how to analyze them, and so I had an enlightened audience. I couldn't just walk in, I think, today and do it.
Teach them. One of them he sent around the world, about 3 to Sri Lanka and Nepal and whatever after going through his class. But he brought all 3 of them, and very different children, but taught them really about many things in this world, the conflicts, but the history and whatever. And I thank Steve all the time about how he did for my 3 kids.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Steve, I hadn't thought of this before, but in our field, Steve and I both have taught American history. 80% of the historians are liberal or radical, and about 20% are conservative. And I understand why the Trumpsters are concerned about the teaching of history. We don't have that balance, and you really have to search hard to find books from a conservative perspective on major events in American history. They're out there, but like Steve has to search, the same is true in the field of history. And I'm not even sure if the Trumpsters are saying anything about this, but if they knew this, it might be more substantive material for them to make their case, but I just don't think they're aware. Maybe on university campuses they are.
Well, I noticed a sea change in the 90s when Fox News went on the air. And that's when I became particularly sensitive to making sure that I presented both sides of controversial issues. And in discussions I conducted in class and evaluations I gave, I always made sure that kids felt comfortable expressing an alternate point of view. And I would ask in a discussion, well, that's what you said, and I appreciate that opinion. Does anybody else have a different opinion? I'm looking for a different opinion, a different perspective. And I always had to be careful when I was explaining just the facts, ma'am, and then times when I was expressing a point of view, and made sure that kids felt comfortable.
If anybody is interested in looking at more political cartoons or cartoons in general, I have a site called gocomics.com in which there are at least 1,000 cartoonists featured. And you can go and look, and they're categorized by name, but also there's a political cartoon section, there's a regular cartoon section. And you can go and scroll through those and see ones for yourself, and then should you decide you want to follow certain cartoonists, you can build a list which will then be delivered, as a group into your email inbox. And that's a real easy way to become more familiar with them.
Yeah. Good, thank you. One more.
Not a question, but you said think times have changed. You can realize how much times have changed when Charlie Sykes is now a guest commentator on MSNBC. Yes,
Yeah.
so it's, I don't think I think the conservatives are divided into two groups, the Trump conservatives and then the conservatives like Charlie Sykes, George Will, and people like that. I mean, there's a thinking conservative and the ones that are sort of gut reaction.